This will be mine. Were your roads bad at all coming up? Yeah, yeah.
Just takes a little time. Okay, all right.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome all of you here to the Chalberg for our forum this evening by the Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government. My name is Greg Blaine. I am the president of the board at the Rosenmeier Center. The Rosenmeier Center was named in honor of former State Senator Gordon Rosenmeier, who represented Little Falls and Crow Wing County, and Gordon was the single most influential and powerful legislator in Minnesota history. And it's through his legacy that our work here continues through the Rosenmeier Center to provide informational forums for the benefit of the public good. It is my honor this evening to have another member of our board as our moderator this evening, Mike O'Rourke, and also our executive director, Steve Wenzel, who I will ask to come forward and introduce our very special guest this evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Greg, for that kind introduction. I deem it a high honor to introduce to you our Rosenmeier Forum speaker tonight. Mary Kiffmeyer, a native of Pierce, Minnesota, represents Sherburne County in the Minnesota State Senate. Senator Kiffmeyer was elected Minnesota Secretary of State in 1998 and was re-elected in 2002. She was elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2008 and served until 2012, when she was elected to the Minnesota State Senate. She chairs the Senate Committee on State Government Finance and Elections. Senator Kiffmeyer brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to the key issue of legislative and congressional redistricting. We know that she will greatly inform the CLC college community and the Brainerd Lakes community of the why and how's decisions that were made by the recent state judicial panel on redistricting. Senator Kiffmeyer also brings great credit and achievements to her role in government. During her 8 years as Secretary of State in charge of elections, Minnesota ranked #1 in the nation in voter turnout for all 8 years of her terms. She also served as president of the National Association of Secretaries of State and was awarded by the Women of Today organization as the Minnesota Woman of Today. It is my honor to introduce Mary Kiffmeyer, Senator Mary Kiffmeyer, as our guest speaker tonight for the Rosenmeier Forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. I so appreciate that. Steve was the Minnesota House member that represented my home in Pierce when I grew up. And my mom and dad knew Steve well, and he'd occasionally stop by the house, say hello to Al and Teresa. You knew their names and knew us as a family. And as a family, that's a big deal because I'm the oldest of 14 children. There's a lot of family when you have 14 kids. And my mom and dad were known for their great work ethic. My maiden name is Sands, so some people, classmates of mine, by the way, I know some students here, and I got elected Secretary of State, they said to each other, Mary got elected Secretary of State. And I said, no, that's a Kiffmeyer. Yeah, that's her married name. She was a Sand. No, she's a Kiffmeyer now. Oh man, they had quite the deal to get it straight. So very glad to have grown up in this area. Was to Brainerd many times and really appreciate it. Want to say thank you to the Rosenmeier organization for their hosting me. So glad to be here and to be close by to my hometown. Means a great deal. And Brainerd, actually, I was telling some young girls that when I was on the bonding committee, one of the places we toured was Central Lakes College to expand your robotics department. And I heard such good things about the robotics department. We made it taller so they could have bigger robots and more electrical power for the needs of the robots of today. And found out that it was the best robotics school in the country, and that they would come from Germany, they'd come from Japan, and look at the students graduating from here to work in their robotics departments. So sometimes you live in a small town and you think, I'm just from Brainerd or Pierce, you know, and but you have good things going on here in Brainerd, and you're the heart, in many ways, of what is going on in the area. We have a cabin over on Round Lake, close to Garrison, and frequently I'm over here in Brainerd shopping, going out to restaurants, and just fun to see the growth in Baxter and Brainerd and all of that. So it's good to be with you tonight. And again, thank you to the Rosenmeier Foundation for having me here and enabling me to speak on this subject. So when I was Secretary of State in 2010, a little known, I should say, in the year 2000, I was elected in 99, but in 2000, lo and behold, here comes this thing of redistricting, and one of the first things that happens is you sue the Secretary of State for not for a plan that no longer fits the population. It's out of balance, right? And so I was sued, and everybody sued me in redistricting, and it was really weird to look back in history and see so-and-so v. Kiffmeyer, so-and-so v. Kiffmeyer. And matter of fact, as Secretary of State, there were a number of court cases that say so-and-so v. Kiffmeyer, because when you are the entity as the head of the Office of Secretary of State, there's certain things when they wanted to sue, they had to sue the Secretary of State's office. Nothing personal, as they said, not personal, it's just the way that it has to be. So I got my toes dipped into the whole redistricting, but even before that, as being in an area, and we moved to Monticello, and lo and behold, there was redistricting. Just about the time I got to know who was my congressman, who was my House member, who was my senator, it changed. It was so discouraging. All of a sudden, you know who you have, you figure it out, you get to know it, and it takes you about 6-8 years to do it, and then 2 years later, they change. And it's hard, and I've always had such sympathy for people who are in a situation like this, that redistricting. So the most frequent question I get, though, is why? Why do they have to do this? Well, let me tell you, I'll go back in history a little bit to kind of explain the why. So most interesting, the earliest memory that I have of where a census is done, because that's what drives redistricting, was in the census was, I don't know if you knew this, but Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem because of a census. That's why Jesus was born in Bethlehem, was because of a census. And so they've been around for, obviously, a very long time. What's different, though, is that the census that was taken then was for the purpose of conscripting young men as soldiers in the military. Or they would do a census for the purpose of knowing how much to tax you and where to find you to collect taxes. So that was most commonly it. With the United States of America, when we wrote our Constitution, something very unique happened that hadn't happened before. A census is required since the very beginning of our country, but the purpose was for equal representation. Equal representation. That was unheard of before the Constitution was written. Many things, by the way, were put in our Constitution because we are a constitutional republic. And that's really important because we have the rule of law and we have a constitution. But in that Constitution, it gives us the ability to vote for our elected representatives. And the purpose of the census was to count everybody, then divide it up in equal portions and assign that to numerical districts. You have to remember that in the early states, there were only 13 of them. And Minnesota's first president that we voted for was Abraham Lincoln. We kind of came along later. Kind of reminds me of my youngest sister, Jane, who was born 23 years after me. She couldn't figure out why she wasn't in my wedding album when I got married. We tried to explain to her she wasn't born yet. She kept insisting, why wouldn't you have me in the picture? Well, you came too late to be in the picture. And so it's just kind of a sense of California, Arizona, Hawaii, and Alaska are the last two states. So now we have a complement of 50 states. Don't know how long that'll last, but right now it's been quite a while we've had 50 states. So the realization that in the census, and the census drives redistricting. And why does redistricting change geographically? The main reason is that you move. People move. And so when they move, then when they do the count, they found out that in my Senate District 30, I had too many people. And some other Senate districts had too few people. They lost population because people had moved. It's your right to do so. And so that imbalance where you don't have equal population means you need to change the boundaries and redistrict and make them equal again. And when that change happens, you notice we can't redistrict into Canada or North Dakota or South Dakota or Iowa or Wisconsin. So you're going to means the change is going to happen within Minnesota. And how do you get to that change? How do you redistrict? Well, the Constitution requires that the legislature develop the redistricting plans, which must be signed by the governor. Well, about 50 years ago, that changed because the legislature couldn't agree, or the governor didn't agree, or even if the governor signed the bill that they had agreed to, all it takes is one person to go to court over that plan. And when they do, then the courts do the redistricting and deal with those kinds of issues. And so in Minnesota for the last 50 years, those 5 times, including this year, the courts again have done the redistricting. We have a split government. We have the House majority controlled by Democrats. The governor is a Democrat. And in the Senate, it's a Senate majority with Republicans. That divided government, one of very few across the United States, meant that coming to agreement was going to be difficult, and besides, all the techniques before it had been done by the court, so it's a little bit easier to defer to the court. And so I want to get to the current redistricting plan. That whole process takes about 2 years, from April 1st of 2020 to start the census, to report the census. You might have noticed something big happened in the middle of that, COVID. So we're going to be looking back in history a lot and what the whole pandemic and COVID happening that changed the normal course of events. And redistricting was one of them. About the time we're ready to go out and do hearings, we can't, or we can't get into buildings, or we can't be together, and there's social distancing, a whole variety of things like that. And we appreciate that, we respect that, but just to know that kind of changed some of the normal course of events of getting together and probably doing some of these things a little bit more. You might have had a better chance without the COVID pandemic. Nevertheless, it was, and that takes about 2 years. So on February 16th, 17th, one of those 2 dates, the Minnesota court released the new redistricting plan. And I want to tell you, we all hang on that hour when they come out with the plans, and they say sometimes all politics is local. Well, it definitely is. Your thought is, what happened to my district? In my case, I represented Big Lake, Elk River, Otsego, Albertville, St. Michael, Hanover, and 14 homes in Dayton. When the plan came out, the only thing that was the same for me was Big Lake. So I lost 80% of the population I've represented before, and then I gained Becker, Clear Lake, Zimmerman, and on up to Princeton. Big change in the district, and I was paired with another senator as well. And so every single legislator, House, Senate, congressional one, they all wait for that plan. It's a big deal because it affects us personally, but it affects every single voter in our district. In this case, people who are used to me being their senator for 10 years, all of a sudden I won't be anymore after January 1st next year. And so we're in the process right now of people adapting to all those new plans, those districts. Where are you? What are you? And the House and the Senate both have detailed plans and information on the redistricting and those kinds of things. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a summary of some statistics that I thought might be of interest to you. Number one, in the census, they found out that Minnesota's population increased by 7.6%. To let you know, we have 8 congressional districts right now. However, we may not 10 years from now, because though we are increasing in population, so are other states, and some of them are increasing more. So Florida gained representation in the U.S. House. Every state has 2 senators, so there's no change there, no matter your population. And so that shifting went around once those congressional seats, but Minnesota kept their 8 congressional districts, and those 8 congressional districts are pretty much the same as they were before. And so that was a sigh of relief to all of those congressional members that, though their lines and boundaries had changed a little bit, Michelle Fischbach in 7th Congressional District came down south a bit to get population. Representative Staver, U.S. Representative Staver, came over a little further to gain some population. 1st Congressional District down in southern Minnesota had to come up north a little bit, but overall pretty much the same. So that issue is pretty well resolved. But when we are dealing with population, I thought of interest to note in the congressional population, they had to have an equal number plus or minus 1. It's a little tricky to count everybody out in a congressional district, but it's big enough they were able to do that. So they could have 713,312 residents, or up to 713,000, or down to 311. Just a plus or minus 1. That's a bit tricky when you're drawing those lines and gathering that population. But that is what drives the whole laying out of the plan. And the judges for that were Judge Bjorkman, Judge Bratvold, Judge Carlson, Judge Freeman, and Judge Williamson. And they did what's called a measured approach. They have felt, and as the courts have before, that when they are doing redistricting, they don't take a big change approach to it. They kind of take the districts as they are and then make some adjustments in population. I would say, except for my district, I'd say, boy, what happened? I keep 20% of my district, and the rest, though I'm familiar with it, actually 10 years ago, I did represent 2/3 of that, so it wasn't too bad for me. But that was the measured approach that they took. The other thing I think is important is the principles of redistricting that the judges used also. And they were pretty classic as far as the principles. So the principles are guidance to them, they're not absolute. In the House and Senate, the population was plus or minus 2%. Makes it a little bit easier to do that nonetheless. So what were those principles? Equal population as far as possible. Contiguous. That means you can't take a couple precincts in Brainerd and a couple precincts from Piers and a couple precincts from Buckman and put them all together for a House or Senate district. No, we can't do that. They have to be connected, contiguous, and not just by a single point. Like if you draw an X and you have that point in the middle, contiguous means bordering to some degree, more than just a single point, contiguous. And not infringing or dividing. I get my glasses. I do pretty well, but if I want to make sure I get this stuff, we'll do that. So, so preserving, not infringing or dividing more than necessary. That's really important. And that affects the communities of interest. It also affects local units of government. So not dividing Morrison County more than necessary, or Aiken County, or Mille Lacs County. Try and keep them together. If you know they're going to have to divide some, but they said not more than necessary. The other thing is communities of interest. There's kind of a natural community. You know, you tend to drive here, drive there. People kind of get used to being in that community of interest. This also matters in inner Minneapolis and inner St. Paul. There is a Latino area. It's always kind of interesting to me. The Irish tend to move into the Irish area of St. Paul. And the Somalians tend to move into an area where they're neighbors to each other. It's more comfortable. It's just kind of a natural thing. You just do. And today I had a bill in my committee to divest some of our Russian investments from the State Board of Investments, done very carefully and respectfully. But we don't want to do that anymore. So you'll notice I have my Stand with Ukraine button. And so we had those. But those Ukrainians tend to congregate together as well. And as they become more familiar, get to know their neighbors, then they, or their kids do, they tend to move around a little bit more. But in the beginning, very often, and there's other just comfortable communities of interest, farming communities, lake areas. You'll have lakes that will naturally come around, and you'll find this area over here because of the roads, maybe because the railroad cuts through you, or a river cuts through, south of the river, north of the river. Just kind of a natural accommodation that you have, communities of interest. Then to be as compact as possible. We're trying not to have like worms or salamanders. That's where gerrymandering came from, was on a salamander. Actually, when you study that salamander district, it was actually reasonable. It looked bad, but when you analyze the whole, where it all went, the communities of interest and all of that, it really wasn't so bad, but it got a really bad name. Sorry to the salamanders that get a bad name used all the time too. And promotes, does not harm a political party or benefit a political party. So you don't go try and make sure you have a bunch of Republicans or a bunch of Democrats, that it's, you don't try and diminish them or enhance them, and not intentionally pair like two House members in the same new House district, or pair senators and so on. And the big thing that the principle that was wanted by the Democrat Party felt that since their state had won by almost 7% with President Biden, they put forward a principle of proportionality. Since they had won 7% of the state of Minnesota, they thought that one of the principles should be that they would win, that they would have a plus 7% of Senate districts or House districts. But the court said that really isn't right to do that way, that individual House and Senate districts make choices not on the basis of president always, but on their individual connections to state House or state senators. And they felt that was important with communities of interest and other things to preserve that. And I agree strongly with that as well. Now, in total, there were about 7 plans that were presented to the court panel. The House Democrats put forward one, the House Republicans, and the Senate Republicans. The Senate Democrats did not put a plan forward from them. And then there were 4 other plans, Mr. Watson, Corey, Anderson, and Sachs, those 4. The courts decided to not use any of the party plans at all, but only use the other ones. Peter Watson, so on and so forth. So that is what they did, and use those 4 plans. Not exactly sure why, but I think they were probably just a little bit keeping themselves away from partisan plans as well. And they had 4 other ones to work with. So they had plenty to use without needing to go into political party plans. That's not always been the case in the past. So some of the results of that, we have 8 congressional districts, and in the court plans, 4 lean Republican, 4 lean Democrat. So right now we do have 4 Republicans, Congressman Stauber, Congresswoman Michelle Fischbach. Sadly, with the passing of Congressman Hagedorn, he just passed away recently. That's an interesting story right there. And then you have Congressman Emmer. That is like a C across the Twin Cities, about there. Minneapolis and St. Paul keep their same individual congressional districts, and I'm just blanking on Dean Phillips, Angie Craig, Ilhan Omar, and Betty McCollum. Couldn't quite remember Betty McCollum. And so those are those 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. Since Congressman Hagedorn passed away and the timing of his death, there's going to be a special election for that congressional seat this year yet. And then immediately after that, they're going to finish out the term that goes to next January. Immediately after that, there'll be another election for that Congressional District 1. There'll be a whole new election that will coincide with November. And then the winner of that will serve the 2-year term after the special. Those poor people down in Congressional District 1, figuring that all out and sorting that all out is very hard. I have a lot of sympathy for the people in this, saying, we're gonna have a primary here, an election there, another primary, and another election, all within a span of about 6 months. So sympathy for them in regards to that. What's interesting here is that when it comes to the House and the Senate, it's considered a plan that is a narrow Democrat to a toss-up. So what the court created was a lot of competitive districts. And so it is not a hard plus Democrat statewide or a plus Republican statewide at all. It's very much competitive. That means anybody can generally win, depending upon who the candidate is, how hard they work, and a variety of factors. In any election year, and this is mid-year of the president's first election, and statistics show that there are big upheavals in that particular case, which may happen this year or may not. We'll have to wait and see. And so pretty well even like that. There's another concept that I came in contact with this year, and that is the concept of efficiency gap. Efficiency gap, what is that to do? And so efficiency means you only get as many votes as you need to win the district. Anything beyond that, more than that, is called inefficiency. Sometimes they're even called wasted votes. In other words, you had more votes than you needed. I hate the term wasted votes because I don't think any votes are wasted whatsoever. But in this particular case, it's just the efficiency gap. So for you to know, in the House and Senate districts in inner city, Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Democrats always win there by 80 to 90%. So for a Republican to run in those areas, that's a pretty tough uphill climb to think you might win in inner city Minneapolis or St. Paul. In the suburbs, that's where you have it much more 50-50, kind of what we call those toss-ups. In rural Minnesota, if you look at the efficiency gap there, it is plus anywhere from 10 to 20. So that would put it at 60 to 70%. You might have that in favor of Republicans in rural Minnesota. But it all depends upon the individual. I would win by, I would say, plus 30%, the 70 to 80% range. But I'm one of the highest ones of the Republicans statewide. So that's just the nature of it, being well known. I also work really hard and do things like that. But in general, in rural Minnesota, it's generally maybe 60%, 65% would be pretty average that Republicans would have the edge. And over the past several years, more and more in rural Minnesota, it's become more and more Republican, and sometimes that's why I think we've had the majority in the Senate is somewhat because of that. So that efficiency gap. So in a House or Senate district, right now the population, it went from about 80,000 that I had the 10 years currently finishing now, and it's gone up to 85,172. And in the House, it's 42,600. That's that equal population. And again, the districts on population are very close, plus or minus 2%, congressional district, plus or minus one person. And so I think the courts did a fair job as far as doing it. Now, what sometimes folks don't realize, we're still not done with redistricting yet. Because you start with the congressional, the national congressional dividing up, then you go to the House and the Senate within the states, except for Nebraska. All they have are senators. They don't have a bicameral House and Senate. They just have a one-body legislature, so they do that. But in Minnesota, we do have the House and the Senate, the checks and balances of the electoral process. But now what happens is your counties, where your county commissioners are, they are to be doing redistricting. Same thing, the population shifts, though not as dramatically. So in Crow Wing County, Mille Lacs County, Morrison County, and so on, the population shifts within a county are not as dramatic. They're, again, plus or minus 2%, but they will do that. And that's a decision your counties are making right now. And with that, at the same time, our cities, so the city of Brainerd is also looking at redistricting, and it makes a difference. Some city council members are all elected at large, meaning they're not elected from a particular part of that city. Same thing with townships. But most of the townships are all at large. Many of the cities are also from the entire city, but there are some who will have city council races where they'll divide up the city into wards or election districts and elect city council members to represent the city only out of that specific part of that city. So that's kind of the redistricting process and some basic information for you tonight. I have to tell you, this is a really busy time. Steve is such a good friend that when he asked me to do this, if I can say yes to Steve, I say yes. And he's so gracious and kind about it. And of course, you never know what's going to be happening. But this is our first deadline week, and we are incredibly busy. So I tried to do some research, but the one thing that I didn't get to do was check out Brainerd and see where your House members and Senate members. I do know you have a paired senator here. Senator Kerry Rude and Senator Justin Eichhorn are paired. They're going to an endorsing convention, see if they sort that out, maybe a primary, whatever it is, they'll work that out. But of the pairings, I thought I'd just mention, and I know the Senate a little bit better than some of the others. So in the Senate, we had some pairings. That means two incumbent senators, both in the new Senate district. So we have Kerry Rude and Justin Eichhorn. That affects all of you right here. Julie Rosen and Rich Draheim were paired. Julie decided to not run again, which leaves Rich Draheim in that district. Senator Carla Nelson was paired with Senator Dornick. Senator Dornick was just a few miles away from a new district that was open, had no incumbent senator. He moved into that Senate district and is running there. And Senator Melissa Franzen was paired up with very long time serving Senator Latz, and she decided not to run again for re-election, and so that leaves Senator Latz having that district. In the House, the minority leader, Senator Dowd, was paired with Representative Dowd was paired with Representative Sandra Erickson, and they've worked that out, and he has a primary, and things are a little bit more complicated in that area. So when there are pairings, so by the way, I'm one of those who was paired. So in my Senate district, I was paired with Senator Andrew Matthews, and I decided to not run for re-election, and that leaves Senator Matthews in my district. If I hadn't been paired, I might have stayed in the Senate. I really like my work. It's an incredible privilege to do and to serve my district, and when you've gained a number of years of experience and knowledge about the process, it's helped me to be very helpful to my district, and I appreciate that. But I know that new candidate in an open seat in another area, Representative Lucero, who I served with, is running for senator in that one, and then Senator Andrew Matthews. So it's going to take two of them to cover my district, and I know they'll both do very well. But it's always a very emotional, hard time. Senator Bach, long time serving in the Minnesota Senate, former majority leader and minority leader. He's also decided not to run again. And he lives up in the Arrowhead region, that point of Minnesota, up in that area. And we really appreciate him very much working with us. But that is the nature. About every 10 years, a lot of changes in who, plus the geography. So that's a little bit of information. I'll be glad to answer questions that you might have.
Thank you, that was very informative. I'm going to hear obviously well versed in this with your experience as Secretary of State and such. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. If you will indulge me just with a brief observation and then a premise that I formed, when they asked me to moderate, I went back and looked at the newspaper stories and I read the court order. And just as a layperson, I thought, looks like these judges really tried to do a good job of being fair and impartial, and they wanted to do it in a restrained manner. It occurred to me, how in the world would a judges panel be improved upon by those states that have a one-party that draws the line? Isn't it by nature going to be more equitable when a somewhat neutral panel does it?
It can be. I know Minnesota, but I would say in general, that's kind of the nature of judges, you know, to do that. But when you do have the one party, remembering though that frequently, a matter of fact, the court cases from 2010 today were still going on in other states. We didn't have a court case, some advantage to the judges doing that. But some of those states, the plans were driven by legislatures. Some were done by commission, a redistricting commission. And by the way, redistricting commission's plans go to court even more frequently than legislatively drawn. So everybody thinks, well, if you have a commission, I consider that very carefully. But when I did my research and looked at it for the cost, the expense, and other things, if it's not going to improve upon the current situation, you know, don't do that. But the court cases rolled in for 10 years, and they were from all right-of-ways, because all it takes is one person to question it, and you may think it's great.
Is that the norm then? And even in the one-party states, does it get challenged and thrown into court? Do courts end up doing most of these?
No, they don't actually end up doing them. They'll often remand them back and say, do it again.
Okay.
All right. Or they'll establish some principles that they need to be sure they apply with. They'll tell them why they're rejecting the plan in the court case and saying, I'll go back and do it right. Most of the time, the court's saying, redistricting, that's not our thing. You know, that's really not what they're cut out to do. So in states like that, wherever they can, they toss it back to, since somebody passed it and signed it into law, that's what they'll do.
But just, it seems to me, as an observer, the least likely group of people I would like drawing the lines would be partisan legislators. No disrespect to you folks, but it's like you have a vested interest in where the lines are drawn. And I think some people have talked about it. I guess it would require a constitutional amendment in the state to either have an independent panel or judges do it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, you have to realize for 50 years you've had the judges do it by choice of the legislature, or by a single person challenging what the legislature got done. It's already there. I don't know that we're going to improve upon it to do that. Yeah, I don't believe in like going through all that money and all that expense and all that work for not getting much anything better than what we currently have right now. But contrary to what is said sometimes, we still have principles to go by. And it's fine with me. I think it's a perfectly good way we have in Minnesota now, where we give suggestions, put out our plans, keep our suggestions, then the court takes them all and comes out with it. On the other hand, when you have 5 hearings of Republicans and 1 of a Democrat, if those hearings are hard, that does not bode well for the courts doing that. I know they're not supposed to try and pair, but when I'm way in the southern end of my district, and Senator Matthews is 2 miles from his old district, I mean, they had to literally go like this to go up there. If you want to talk about a salamander, that's, came pretty close to it. Other ones, the other one too, they started down and came up. That was a little bit more reasonable. But I never know what's really in the mind of the judges when they do that. On the other hand, in Wright County, they pretty much stayed the same as before. And we didn't really touch them at all, so I'm not quite sure. But usually you work your plan in from the northeast corner, so on, you work your way. Sometimes you go to the middle. And because of where we are located, often the dividing lines are going to get a little touchy when they get to our area. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, with the luck of the draw, we worked it out.
Overall, were you pleased with what the judges came up with?
Overall, yes.
For whatever reason, it did seem to affect a lot of women legislators adversely, yourself included. And you made a decision not to run. You mentioned.
Well, of the pairings, actually, for us, 1, 2, 3, 4 were women paired with a guy, and a Democrat woman paired with a guy. No, not 2 men, not 2 women even. But we're grown-ups. Take the plans, make our decisions, as we all have.
What can you explain the principle of preserving communities of interest? What's behind that? What's the thought?
I think it's more of a kind of humanity, that we're human beings. We'll have an affinity for that. And so in your neighborhoods, sometimes you might call it in your neighborhoods. So taking a neighborhood, dividing it in half or in thirds, makes it hard for them to have a cohesive approach. On the other hand, I look at it and say, you could have 1 senator or House member in your community of interest. That's great. But if you're divided up, you might have 2 or 3 interested in your community. I look at it differently. I think the principle is still sound, but this probably affects more a county. All the counties don't want anybody to divide them. Oh my goodness sakes, that's absolutely impossible with a plus or 1 vote or a plus or minus 2%. It can't be. But do it as little as possible, and that's where the communities of interest come together. But I look at it as saying, if you have more people that are a part of your county or your city, there are going to be more people interested in your area. I think that's a good thing.
One of the results of that, following that principle, appears to have been in the 8th district, congressional district, all of the Indian tribes, the Indian reservations, are united in one northern, in 8th district, which someone argues, well, that gives us more power within that district, and you offered the other theory on that.
I personally think that next time they're going to say, is that really such a good idea?
They might think differently of that down the road. Why do you say that? Because
well,
what you just said?
They have 1, whereas otherwise they could have had 2.
All right. We're very much, Minnesota, I would say, is a very politically competitive state. Do the judges have an interest? Well, and you're asking to read their mind, but are they trying to create competitive districts as best they can?
In general, anytime you have a redistricting plan, you want to have competitive as you can, and yet you've got all these other principles, right? So you've got to do all of those and try and make them competitive.
So that's maybe one factor among many.
One factor among many.
Okay.
And then you have a plus 80, 90% victory for Democrats. Inner city Minneapolis, St. Paul. How do you make them competitive? If you did that, you kind of have to have a pencil district where you go from inner city Minneapolis and go up to Anoka. Well, then you break the principle of communities of interest and compact and other things.
In the order they talked about, the judges said, we want to do this without protecting, promoting, or defeating any incumbent candidate or party. They're saying they want to. And I don't know if you know this, but are the judges even aware of where the various candidates live? In broad terms, they know where someone lives, but they don't know the street and exactly. Do you think they just put that out of their minds as best they can?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of wonder the same thing too. I do know that as chair of the State Government Policy and Finance and Elections, I had redistricting in my committee. And so I knew this happens once every 10 years, so you got to brush up again on what everything was. So I spent the 2 years before. I went to a National Conference of State Legislatures where they had a 5-day meeting. And every day for 5 days, I did nothing but either elections, redistricting, or campaign finance. I did nothing but that for those 5 days. Also had a manual, and I went on a site visit to Los Angeles County to see what they were doing. Interesting thing, Los Angeles County was going to go like Minnesota and have precinct optical scan machines in their precincts instead of the giant old-fashioned IBM, put the cards in. That's what they went from. But I just invested in the time of doing that to get ready for that. It is a once every 10 years thing. So it is a challenge. But in general, conversation around the judges and that, I had a chance then to do redistricting and to practice all these principles. But we have software today. So in the software, you can, but the one thing they left in rivers, major highways, lakes, major streets, kind of like thoroughfare type street, like a Broadway street or a Main Street. And then your job was, it was a very large county in Ohio, and your job was to divide that up. It was kind of a mock situation. But you couldn't know where any of the incumbents were. You just had to follow all the other principles. And then later on find out what did you do. I'm not sure if that's what these judges did in this situation. And it just coincidentally happened to be this way. I don't know.
Okay. In your situation, you were paired up with another Republican incumbent. And from what I gathered from what you said, the new district was more conducive to him in terms of people he represented, and that entered into your decision not to run?
Well, it's a mixture of things as usual, making that decision. But the big thing for me is when you have a brand new senator who's never served before and they're running for their first term, they have to learn the ropes, get that experience, get into it. Senator Matthews has been a senator for 6 years. He chairs the Civil Law Committee, so he has knowledge and experience, and he fits the district really well. And so I felt that to make him move into a different kind of an area, which would have been very good for him as well, that he, as a younger senator, would have 10 years in that district for those people to get to know him. If I would have stayed for another 4 years or so, that would have meant after 4 years, then you do that. It is valuable in a district to have a senator with experience and knowledge about the process. It enables you to help get things done for the people of your district. So, for example, I had Interstate 94. Some of you may drive Interstate 94. Well, from Maple Grove to Clearwater, that stretch of 94, I've been able to get almost $700 million in transportation money to expand it from 4 lanes 6 lanes. And that construction is pretty close to being done. So in 10 years, there was $0 for that highway, $0 in the 25-year plan. And so from 0 to today, but I'd served 4 years in the House on the Transportation Committee, and as Secretary of State, I came with some knowledge of the process as well, obviously. But I also knew the executive branch, which kind of came in handy when I would meet with commissioners. I kind of knew how they did things because I knew the executive branch. So I was able to bring that to bear, work very strongly. And then in Elk River, we also got the money to convert that from 5 stoplights to a throughway for those who are going north from Highway 10 up 169 as well. So both those areas, much to the chagrin, by the way, of my fellow senators who are trying to figure out how I did that. But I made friends with engineers. I learned, I became a student of transportation, how it was funded, what can I do to help, what are the numbers, and we ran the numbers. And the highway number of cars every single day on our highways was beyond any other that needed construction in the state of Minnesota. I made my case, I worked hard at it, convinced enough people to get some of that done. But Senator Matthews has that 6 years. And then people get to know him. So even though for myself in some ways I would like to, I bring a lot of experience with that, I felt for the good of the people it would be better to make that decision. Not all bad, by the way. I have 16 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren, 4 kids. My husband's retired, and so while I love it, I thought this is the right thing, but mainly for the people of the district. And that went on, by the way, Senator Dorning, a lot of those.
How does it, when you, that afternoon, I think it was noontime, that came out, you see, oh gosh, I'm paired with this person who you knew and worked with, and I'm correct, it's the same party.
Yes.
Okay. Do you talk to each other informally? And
Yeah.
oh, you do. Okay.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
The
And
first thing is all of a sudden he comes to my office and comes in the doorway and looks at me and he said, I'm not going to challenge you for endorsement, not going to challenge you in the primary, and I'll move if you decide to stay. I
Oh,
said, "Okay."
well, that was
That is
he
actually
made that
protocol.
offer.
The junior senator would defer to the senior senator.
Really.
Yes, often.
And he made, so you had that option.
I had the option, yes, but it would
'Cause
have
he was-
meant his moving.
Yeah.
And as I explained already, now in Senator Dorning, he moved 2 miles away to be in an open Senate district. Senator Nelson stayed. And, that's it. You've got to make decisions somehow, some way. But in the situation with Senator Root and Senator Eichhorn, he's a freshman, more a junior senator, and she's senior. They're going to compete.
Okay. Do you think you might look at a position in the legislature 2 years down the road, or any other political office at this stage of your career?
Well, I have a heart for public service. I don't know for sure. By the way, what I say is I'm not retiring. I am restructuring. I learned that from brother-in-law, who's a psychiatrist. He said, not retiring.
That's good.
I like that. I want to be productive all my life, but maybe in different ways. And, right now, I've always believed that first, do the job in front of you. And that's what the people have elected me to do. First, do that. And I see that a lot amongst our senators. They're carrying on with their work. And at the same time, they have to deal with personal decisions. That's always the case. We have 2 senators that had heart attacks on a Friday, and they were back at work on Monday, both of them. They had stints put in. Now they're in light duty, but they're showing up, they're voting, perfectly mentally sharp. These days, you recover real quickly. But that kind of commitment, there's not a lot of other employers. You couldn't at least take off a week or 2, but that's not the case in the legislature. It is. And it is, so we'll see.
Okay.
I have calls. But
The last question I wanted to ask you, you made reference to the late Representative Hagedorn's district. Second or first? First. Now, my understanding, they're going to run the primary here, and that's going to be under the current boundaries.
yes,
Now, then when the election,
the next primary
The next-
again for that district.
So then the 2020 election that everyone's going to be in, then they will for the new, that's got to be strange for them.
We have a great deal of compassion for those voters in Congressional District 1. I mean, you just, I want to say a prayer for them. I'm sure they'd be glad to have it. But yeah, they're going to have 2 primaries and 2 elections.
Oh, boy.
For the old district and then for, those kinds of things happen more frequently than you think, such as somebody winning by 1 vote. Every election, every single year, it's a 1-vote decision. Matter of fact, on a city council race last 2020, 21 it was, I think it was, but they were on the off year. We had a mayor who won by 1 vote.
Every vote counts then.
Yes, and I'm sure there are people who, for either candidate, say, wish we had gone to vote. You never know how close it's going to be till the day after, and then it's too late. So whatever, just go vote for the candidate of your choice, and then whatever happens, you won't have to deal with. I wish I would have. But in that case, she kept her 1-vote lead and gained another vote, so she doubled her lead from 1 to 2.
Well, thank you. Eric Klang, I'm going to ask you to get the microphone and see if the audience has any questions. Anyone, if any?
We can,
Walk the microphone out to you.
Yes, yes, we will. The mics have been a little difficult tonight. You guys aren't coming through really, so.
that's good.
There we go. I guess you got to hold it right up next to your face. Who's got a question for Mary? All right.
Thank you, Mary, for being here tonight. Our family enjoyed the little Dairy Queen in Pierce for many years.
Yes.
Mary,
My mother started
as
that.
former Secretary of State, this question pertains to, could you share your history knowledge of the Dominion voting machines? How did we get them? And how are we going to get rid of them before the 22 election? Because we know that there's illicit things going on. We do not trust voting on those machines. And I know people that have told me that they won't vote again until those machines are gone. And as we know, you know as well, Mike Lindell has been fighting for full forensic audits. I know I noticed in your face that that kind of got a reaction. And Minnesota is one of the states that he's coming to help us get rid of these machines. Could you tell us how we should progress towards getting rid of these things? And the paper ballots, how to get paper ballots that are serialized on special paper to guarantee that we can look up our votes as well as have security on those votes by having a secure number that we can take off, as Mike Lindell suggested, through his panels, that these papers could be guaranteed foolproof. And thank you for your answer.
Well, thank you very much for that question. A little off redistricting, but I will just quickly say the purchasing of equipment is done by your local unit of government, mostly your counties. In Minneapolis, in Hennepin County, it'll be Minneapolis, because they're just larger populations and so on. St. Paul, actually, Ramsey County runs the St. Paul election system. But it is done by the local units of government, and it is the counties who make those decisions. So the questions about the purchasing of Dominion, you have to remember, before now, Dominion was being used and was being sold, certified by the Secretary of State to be sold in the state of Minnesota. So that is the case right now. And it's extremely expensive to buy new equipment, right? So some of it is the question of equipment. But I think one thing that I am doing in legislation right now, though, is, some of you don't know, but there's what's called a public accuracy test. It is done before every election, and in particular, we'll take this year, before the primary and before the general election. The county will take the equipment and they will have a stack deck, might say. It's marked ahead of time for how the vote result should come out. They'll run it through the machine. It's all in a complicated Excel spreadsheet. They run it through the machine, marked ballots, actual paper ballots, and then they'll match it to see if the machine counted like it was supposed to. That's a public accuracy test of the programming of that machine. And so, but right now, the county's only required to give a 2-day notice. Most people don't know about it, they don't get the information. So what I'm putting in place in a new law would be 14 days before the test. They have to put the notice in the paper. They have to notify each political party, and we're going to add candidates to that as well. So they do the public notice. That means someone like you would be able to know about it, come to where the public accuracy test is done, and you don't touch ballots, you don't touch machines, you don't talk to the people doing the public accuracy test, but you will be able to observe that and check it out. I just think it is 2 days notice, some of these other things. I think it's way, way more important that people have that opportunity to observe that public accuracy test. Another way they test the machine after the election, which is something that I put in place as a part of the Help America Vote Act, was to put in place in Minnesota audits after the election. That means there are random precincts chosen in every single county in Minnesota, and then there is a hand count of all the ballots, and that is matched against the result. And this is done within a week or so after the election. So it's done in time that if they find something not right, then they have to use more precincts. If that's still not right, they have to do a hand count of a larger area, and it continues to grow more and more. That is current law, and last year I strengthened that area of law as well. They had kind of like a percent, but it was too big of a gap, I felt. I feel the machine should be accurate exactly. So we gave them 1 vote. They could be 1 off. That's it. Because sometimes when a machine is, when a person is marking it, they show clearly who they want to vote for, but they just put a tiny dot inside the oval. And then the machine sometimes doesn't catch that. In a hand count like that, and that's not a recount, it's an audit after the election. So we have public accuracy test, and then we have an audit afterwards. So I hope I've answered that question, and who purchases the local units of government. And forensic audits, right now the Secretary of State by himself can do a forensic audit of the software programming, but he's chosen not to do it. I don't want to take away from redistricting. They brought me here to talk about that, so I think that should be.
It's just that we know those machines can be hacked. Experts are saying there's no way to foolproof those
Okay,
machines.
we're going to let somebody else do a question, and thank you for your comments.
All right, who's next? Who's got another question?
Worn out.
They're shy.
It helps, doesn't it, to have the microphone come to you?
First off, thank you for.
What's your first name?
Sure, my name is Kay. First off, thank you for coming and for being here. This has been really insightful, so thank you. I'm wondering, for districts that, after the redistricting, are left without an incumbent, is there some sort of recruiting process that the parties undergo? And if so, what does that entail?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question, Kay. How do you get people elected in those open districts, House or Senate, that has no incumbent? That's what's really, I think, kind of neat about redistricting. It often infuses the legislature with some new blood. From that perspective, that's not an unusual thing. But in those open seats like that, immediately both political parties in Minnesota, Democrat and Republican, they will go ahead and be recruiting. And so already that happens. Sometimes even before, they try and have different people in different areas that might be ready to go. And then sometimes, as it happened with a friend of ours, John Peterson, I thought he was in St. Cloud, but he moved to Buffalo, and he was ready to go, but there was no opening for him, and he liked who was representing him, so he didn't. But usually the political parties, yes, they're very active that way, and they recruit people to run. That's how those open seats are filled. Plus, any individual person at that point, I mean, there's recruiting, of course, but at that point, sometimes people you never thought of being interested take a look at the plan and say, you know, I think I'd like to do that. And we have that this year in my area, somebody who never expressed an interest before, but was a mayor and decided on very short notice to do so. But an incumbent House member was running and already had represented 3/4 of the district. So for him, that was an edge to him because the people knew him. But we really welcome that, and I think it's always neat to have somebody step into that, and they can, but both those ways. Thank you, Kate.
Who's next? All right.
I've read, my name's Tom, and I've read, I read a lot about redistricting and everything, and it seems Minnesota always has it done pretty well. You never hear we're going to have Democrats change 6 in the Democratic state. Well, how does that work when the legislature of a Democratic state say, well, we're going to change 6 House seats into Democrats, or vice versa? We're going to change it by redistricting. We should gain 6 House seats in for Republicans. It's kind of you go, that can't be right. And sometimes the court will take them, like Pennsylvania decided they won't take the thing this year or something, and one was, oh, then the court is we're not going to allow that redistricting and everything, and some do, some don't, and it's according to who the politics are in power. My question is, how does that work? How can that be right? That you can make those salamanders up and change a district?
Well, thank you, Tom. Good question. So that's why the principles are so important. The principles are really the guardrails that help to be sure that they're more competitive and more fair in that regard and aren't in that situation. The court agreed with you that that proportional kind of thing wasn't fair, wasn't good for individual Senate districts and the individual House districts. So the court agreed with that and prevailed here in the state of Minnesota. I had hearings in my committee on that, and we had a great deal of discussion. The Democrats proposed proportional, and we opposed it. We wanted to stay with the traditional, the classic, what the court had pretty much used, which they did this year as well. And to keep that together, I would say with anything, the reservations asked to have them together, and they got what they wanted. And but in general, the court agreed with those tried and true principles that have worked well for us for 50 years. Use them again this year. But you know, as usual, judges change, legislators change, Minnesota changes. And by the way, Minnesota used to be a state that was 100% always went Democrat, statewide, and in the House and the Senate. Matter of fact, in the Senate, for 50 years consecutively, from when Minnesota went from being organized by conservative and liberal, and you decide which one you were in the Senate. I'll just speak about that. And then when there was a change so that they went by party designation, Republican or Democrat, after that decision for 50 years, only Democrats had the majority in the Minnesota Senate. In these last 10 years, we've had 8 out of the 10 years with majority Republicans. And that's a first in the history of Minnesota. The House has sometimes split majority-minority quite frequently. They never seem to stay in a pattern for very long, but a very unique situation in the Senate. But remember that we find that with winning elections, the strength of the individual candidate, the makeup of the district, and the political party balance in that particular district, those are three factors. Of the three, the most important is the candidate. They fit the district, they work hard, and they take positions on the issues that most people in that district are in support of. So I'm a pro-life candidate in my district, that fits, that's what they are. Ron Latz in inner city Minneapolis, I wouldn't go over too well there because that's not largely what their area has. And so those candidates and how they fit their districts are really more important even sometimes than the geography.
Anybody else? Young people, be thinking about something.
Up in the right-hand side, gentlemen. He's going to make you walk.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay.
Hello, my name is Jamar. I kind of have like a little simple question. I just want to know, like growing up, is this like always like a job like you plan on like having, like, you know, and helping the community, stuff like that?
Growing up, did you think this was a job you wanted to do, helping the community? Is that?
That is a really good question. A lot of young people are, how did you get from here, growing up and all that stuff, into here? No, I did not think someday I'm going to be president or House or Senate or elected to anything. I grew up as, you know, just working jobs and doing things that I could do. Although my uncle, Paul Sand, who was Attorney General of North Dakota and then a Supreme Court Justice in North Dakota, Uncle Paul would sit at the kitchen table and talk to me like a grown-up. Of all the things that affected me so much was Uncle Paul. And he asked me what I'd like to do when I grew up. I'm 12 years old. I hadn't given it a thought whatsoever. But he was an adult, and he did. And just by asking me the question helped me to think about it. And when I graduated from high school in 1964, the two main jobs for women were nursing or teaching. I chose nursing. I'm a registered nurse, former registered nurse. But Uncle Paul got me thinking about what is that future? What is that life? And I've often appealed to those of us who are more mature to reach out to young people. I had a great little conversation with 3 young gals that came in today. Try wherever I can. And that's how impactful Uncle Paul was on my life. Ever since he asked me a question about my future and talked to me, I've tried to pass it forward wherever I can to talk to young people. But I didn't. Although I was on the high school debate team, which girls didn't do in those days. And I'm very competitive. You don't want to do, you know, those go-karts where you race them? It just comes out of me. I'm getting in those corners and doing all of that, but being fair about it. But I didn't really think about anything like that. I think if anything, I think I was like, how can I, from a very poor family in a little town of Pierce, if anything, it was more of a mindset that I couldn't aspire to a big position because I came from a little town. So it's kind of a weird thing. But I think for us, for you as young people, it's a really good proverb. There's wisdom in many counselors. And so it's okay to stay in your smaller circle and you have your friends and you do those things. Sometimes that's what it becomes, that small circle of knowledge or information. And have a chat with people around you. Maybe you like what they're doing or whatever. And I've had a chance to do this with people who have said to me, how then did you get to where you're at today? I didn't set out a career path. But you know what I did do that when I look back? I took the jobs that nobody else wanted and I did them really well. And I've heard from more people and other folks that say many career people have many times just kind of did that kind of a eclectic path kind of a thing. But talk to others, adults around you who are maybe salesmen, different kind of careers, maybe you kind of like interest in healthcare. Ask them this question: how did you become a doctor? Not why. That's really hard to explain what motivates you sometimes, but how. What was the path you took? You will find the most interesting stories when you ask them how. What is most helpful to you is when you hear how they did that. And then you say, oh, I see. When you ask a bunch of other people, how did you get to drive truck? How did you come to that? How did you get to be a nurse? How did you get to be driving that great big semi truck or whatever? I'm kind of stuck in truck mode, I guess. I just came from transportation, so trucks are in my mind right now. It was a bill that we were listening to about farming up in northern Minnesota, by the way, and weights in regards to carrying grass seed when it's raw and unprocessed. It's a big deal for those who are in that business. Fascinating what you get to learn when you're in the legislature. But ask the questions about how they got to be a professor, how they got to be a teacher or a dentist, or how they got to be working in the drugstore as a pharmacist. And it's a great question to ask because people like to talk about why or how they did that. And they like young people to answer that question because they were young once too. You have to remember, when I grew up, there weren't any computers. There wasn't any internet. And who knows what in your future is going to be brand new that you know nothing about. I did an IBM test at the Morrison County Fair one time. I think that could have led to computer work. I've done computer work. I'm self-taught. I did database work and did 5 major IT projects in the Secretary of State office. 5 major IT projects in 8 years. And so even as a nurse, people say, but she's a nurse. She's not a lawyer, so she can't do lawmaking. I'm a regular person. I can read, I can learn and understand. So don't be limited by where you are today. Where could you go? Sometimes you just need to know how.
You find,
You didn't work on the DMV though, just to be clear.
No, I helped correct it. Yes. Oh, that Min Lars, and we went to Min Drive. Pain and suffering and all the phone calls, but we heard you.
while they're thinking of another question, do you find it more difficult to encourage people to consider public office because politics is it's kind of perceived as a rougher game now, maybe more than it was 20 years ago?
No, always been rough.
Okay.
You read the history of Abraham Lincoln, you read the history of George Washington, you read that history, I want to tell you, they had fistfights in the House chamber in Washington now, but they had fistfights. They had duels, point guns at each other, and settle their disagreements that way. Senator Rood and Senator Eichhorn are being much nicer, much better, I assure you. So just go back and read the real history. You know that rear view mirror saying things in the past are, the rear view mirror, they're not quite like what they seem.
Yeah.
At any rate, sometimes history gets sanitized because it's kind of back further and you forget the rough and tumble, but I assure you, there was plenty of rough and tumble.
But if you're interested, you should look into government and run.
Yes.
It's a good public service.
And there are many ways to do it: city council, school board, township, and there are also boards that you can volunteer to work on. In the city council, they have planning and zoning, they have parks and recreation, and you don't have to be elected to those, but it gives you a chance to kind of get to see what's going on. And there are many, many areas like that that you can just do. Knock on their door. Of course, I'm pretty familiar with knocking on doors, but literally go to City Hall and say, I'd like to help. I'd like to do some public service where I don't have to be elected. There's something that you think I could do. See what happens.
Buford Johnson's the name. First, I want to thank you.
Your first name was?
Buford.
Buford. B-U-R-F-O-R-D.
Oh, Buford.
First, I want to thank you for coming. You're very inspiring. And I really appreciated having you here and learned a lot from you. The one quick question I have, what role did the legislative body play during that crisis in COVID on the mail-out ballots. Was it something they directed, or was it something that happened at the Secretary of State's office?
Well, I think the hardest thing that when we went through this whole COVID thing was an upheaval of the legislative role. We really felt that the legislature was set aside, and with the current law, the way it was established with emergency powers, it became much more of a executive deciding many things, and the legislature. The big thing is understanding that the legislature, because you have representatives from across the whole state of Minnesota, have the voices of people coming through 201 people instead of one as a governor. And we really do hope that we can change those emergency powers laws so that they don't shut out the legislative role. We have separation of powers, and we feel, while we respect what was happening with the pandemic, but there was way too much of that going on. It wasn't really good for the people. Matter of fact, we had a bill recently where we're correcting a task force that was made up with almost no legislative input on the sub-minimum wage task force. I don't even know why we did it, because that wasn't an urgent need during the pandemic. But we're trying to fix it now. And there are several areas like that that we're trying to fix it. But the legislature still be in play even in an emergency. And that has been the case in the past. This is the first time the legislature was totally frozen out of so many decisions. It's not unhealthy. Our form of government with checks and balances on the federal level and on the state level, and even within your cities as well, and your counties, as much as possible. But it's a healthy thing for our country. It's why we've been able to stand as a country and be what we are because of that. Sometimes it's frustrating as heck when you want a bill to be passed and you can't get it done. But, you know, it's meant to be lots of checks and balances with that so that it doesn't have wild swings like they can have in other countries. Even a benevolent dictator is still not a good way, because the next time might be a not good dictator, as you see in Russia right now, that they say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so too much power, we're still human beings, it's not a healthy thing for our country. So the legislature is should never have been in that situation, but under those current laws that we were, and the effect of the pandemic itself, I would have to say over the last 2 years, constituents that I worked with, and many of them know me from across the state, and the phone calls, elderly people in their homes, in the nursing homes, not being able to have contact with their family members, who actually help to augment the nursing home staff by being there for them when they're real sick. They were shut out from that. Stories that I went through hour after hour, day after day, of listening to those stories and those hard things, and the children as well. As a nurse, public health, quarantine the sick, shelter the vulnerable, the rest of us work to take care of those two. That was turned on its head. Absolutely was an amazing thing for me. And the healthcare system, because of that, is also reeling from a situation that upended it, and people even now, they thought there would be a big rush to getting, you might say, healthcare, and it's not. People are now afraid of a system that they should be able to trust to work on their behalf. These are the stories, these are the things that are happening, and so we need to be sure as we go through this to help restore a good balance of power in times of emergency. And I think that's something for a future legislature to make that decision. And sometimes you need to get a little away from the urgency of right now, make those kinds of decisions. But I think it needs to happen. I hope it will happen in the coming years.
Anything else?
Mary, thank you so much for sharing your time with us, especially at a time where you don't have a lot of time in your work at the legislature. And I wanted to ask you a question, though, going back in reference to redistricting, and you shared with us that you were comfortable with the plan that was put forward by the courts here, but you also shared with us experience that you've had in your work as a legislator and education that you've gotten on this topic. Would you share for us maybe one point or maybe more than one, if you know of, that you would like to see the process recognize or endorse going forward, if this process could be improved as far as redistricting? And thank you for being here.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate that. I would say that I would think it's really important to not do the proportional principle. I think that is really damaging to representation of the needs of other principles. I think that's going to be an important area to be sure that we keep that out. And the rest of it is, I think, the involvement of the people in this redistricting process was diminished by about 2/3 because of the pandemic. So the normal, you being able to speak to us, for us to go to the city of Brainerd and hear from you, a lot of those things was so limited because of COVID. But those two things, one, we have to be sure and pay attention to that. And in 10 years, when there's redistricting, and Brainerd's a population center, so frequently this area will tend to have the courts or political parties or somebody come and have it, or you can just write letters or send an email to them and say, don't do proportional, and give a couple sentences as to why. And be engaged in that process and pay attention to that. And it's sometimes easier than you think. And I would say that that proportional thing, as far as the engagement and speaking up to it, the courts listen to you, especially in redistricting, but as usual, the saying is, he who shows up rules the rules. And if you don't show up and you don't participate, then you're leaving it to others to decide for you. The same thing with voting. If you don't go vote, you're leaving it up to others to decide for you. And I would encourage you, in regards to that, whatever the system is, you could go to your county office, and there are ways to do things, and working on that for you even now through my committee, working with your county officials, but never ever say, I'm not going to go vote because or whatever. Just simply go and vote. Know who are your candidates. You have a job as a citizen to know and not be spoon-fed. You're grown-ups. By the time you're 18, talk to your friends. Let's figure this out. Let's do it. Afterward, let's go have a bite to eat together, or let's get together at the house. There's a feature that I did when I was Secretary of State called My Ballot. The precinct finder, and then at the side it says My Ballot. You click on that, and it'll pull from all the databases and give you a printout, not a ballot, not anything to vote on, but it'll lay out kind of like a ballot. It'll be laid out so it looks somewhat familiar to you, who the actual people for each office would be on the actual ballot. And that's been there since 2000. But it's not known as well. We're trying to do some work together to help make it more known. And then you can take that and even study the candidates, pay attention, save their literature, kind of do that. When you're ready, do a pretend mark if you want. And if you think, yep, this is who I want to vote for, you just hold it up and put it in your purse, put it in your pocket. When you're in the privacy of the voting booth, you can pull it out, your notes. And so you're able to bring your notes in with you, and that My Ballot feature can be so helpful to you. I've said before, if you need help on elections, sos.state.mn.us. Get to that website in the search bar or wherever it is, type in my ballot and you see what you find. I'm not in charge there anymore, so I'm not quite sure, but I know that works on just about every website. So I try to give you some help with that. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have any others? We got one more back here.
Now we will have to wrap it pretty quick.
Hi, I'm Sylvia. I'm just wondering, if Minnesota were to lose a congressional seat, then it would have an odd number of seats, and then one political party would have more seats than the other. So I'm wondering what kinds of conflict you think would arise in the Minnesota legislature if that were to happen.
Okay, in the current 8 congressional districts, those are U.S. representatives, so they're not state representatives. So those, if it were 7, they would go to Congress, which is in Washington, D.C. There's a total of 435 of them, so the 7 would blend in with that 435. And, but yeah, that is the case. And by the way, it wasn't always 4 and 4. It used to be 7 and 1, then it was 6 and 2, then it was 5 and 3, and in this last with Senator Michelle Fischbach, Congresswoman Michelle Fischbach, we ended up with 4 and 4. So that's fairly customary to kind of have that. It could swing one way or the other. But because they go to Washington, D.C. and serve in Congress, where there's 435, it all blends in. By the way, in the state Senate here in Minnesota, we have 67 state senators, and we have 134 House members. So in every Senate district in Minnesota, there's 1 senator and then 2 House members out of that same geography. And it's 67 and 134, obviously. 2 times 67 is 134. And in the Senate, it's an odd number. In the House, it's an even number. But we all make it work. Good question, though.
Yeah.
It was way back.
We have one more question? All right, we do.
Do you have to drive home today? Oh.
Hi, my name's Isabel. My question, what are the reasons behind having to pair senators for a district when redistricting?
What's the reason for pairing? Actually, one of the principles is not to try to pair or try to not pair. So it's kind of more of a blind thing where you don't know where they actually live. And then they draw the districts, and when they're all done, they take the veil off, I say, and say, see all the stars and where everybody lives. That's kind of the idea behind that. And I don't know for sure because I can't speak to them and they haven't responded to how did we end up getting so many pairings in particular in this kind of way. Was it truly just coincidence or was it something else? So we don't know. But generally that's kind of the idea, blind redistricting, and only after you're done you take a look and see what happened to the incumbents. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you want to do one more? One. All right, stand by.
I have to give short answers too better.
Yeah.
This will have to be it because I think you may have to drive. Okay.
I'll make it quick, but you know, you're talking about filling out ballots. One of the things that came up when people were voting is we used to do it with ink pens, and this time they were allowing felt tip markers.
I should just come here and just ask questions like that.
Yeah.
And what's interesting on the pen controversy, in past days, the machines were programmed and they were very sensitive to an ink pen at reflected light. And so the machines are much touchier in regards to that, so they really were specific. You couldn't even use a red pen, you had to do different things. But the machines now have recognized the fact that somebody comes in to take a pen out of their pocket, right? That would be my husband. $60 carries pens in his pocket, and he's had some disaster with shirts too when he puts them back. But the machines have been designed now in such a way, the software is better, they're able to read things more clearly, and that is an issue like it used to be.
Thank you much, Senator Kiffmeyer.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah, Mary, we want to thank you for your years of service and the good job that you've done for the great state of Minnesota. And we just, can we give her a round of applause? Mary's going to stay around for a little bit, so if you have questions, you want to meet and greet her, you can come up here and do that. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming. We're glad you showed up. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you were up here with me. It was very helpful. Oh, yeah.